Welcome to this week's episode of Inside the Headset presented by CoachComm. This week, we sit down with Illinois head coach Bret Bielema. In this conversation, Coach Bielema discusses starting out at his alma mater, working with legendary coaches, and the impact coaches can have on their players. But first, a word from CoachComm.
Deuce left, check with me. If they're in quarters match, we're going to Pittsburgh or Ohio.
They're in zero.
Let's go Hippo, Seattle, wide choice. If we call the protection right, it's 6.
When a play call is the difference between winning and losing, your headset choice could be your most important decision. When the call counts, CoachComm is the only choice for clear, dependable communication. Visit CoachComm.com for more info.
We got it, guys. Good job.
Now, let's get inside the headset with Coach Bielema.
Coach, what's going on? How are you?
I'm doing good, Mario. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a pleasure when I can get a head ball coach on. I know how valuable that time is, and so I'm very much appreciative. So let's kind of dive into this thing. The first question we always start the podcast off with is, when did you know you want to be a part of this great profession?
You know, it's a great question. I don't know if I ever had one of those aha moments where I kind of knew that that's what I wanted to do. I actually, I was definitely very much shaped early in my athletic career, going back to junior high school, by the coaches I was around. My father was a huge influence in my life. I had 2 older brothers that, because I watched them play football, obviously got ingrained with that. But I didn't go to college with the expectation to coach. I went in with actually I was a pre-law. How crazy is that?
Wow.
I quickly converted from pre-law to business. I do think back now, I've been asked that a lot of times during coaching, and unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, when I found coaching, I think was actually through a moment of adversity for myself. I was a sophomore at the University of Iowa, and I was part of a very special program with Hayden Fry, a guy that meant a lot to the American Football Coach Association in his career. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but Coach Fry was a heavy influence on my life without me knowing it. And then during the middle of the football season, I actually went through a pretty traumatic time. My sister was actually killed in a tragic accident when I was playing a game at Michigan, and we literally won that game. I kind of knew coming out of that game, this is back in 1990, I knew that at that point, if we won the rest of our games, we'd be going to the Rose Bowl. She lived in Seattle. I got back to the University of Iowa. I was literally in my dormitory, just got back to campus, and I turned around, and my positional coach, Ted Gill, was literally standing in my doorway. And I this was way before cell phones, anything like that. I didn't know why or what he was doing there. And he proceeded to have to be the bearer of bad news and tell me my sister had tragically been killed that day during a pretty unusual set of circumstances that took her life. And he then had told a couple of my teammates. They came in, took care of me. But over the next several months, I literally had not only Coach Gill, my position coach, my head coach Hayden Fry, but all kinds of support staff literally check on me on a daily basis. And I think because of that moment in time when I had to learn on people or lean on people that weren't my family, because I was away from my family by just the true nature of being in the fall football season. I was gone for a few days, obviously, processed my sister's passing and the funeral, but for several months, they were my family, right? And I think that to this day is one of the things that drove me to coaching. Is out of that moment, I realized how much of an impact those coaches had on my life.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, I was obviously sorry to hear the story, but it just, that puts perspective in me, how many halls I walk through and you see that term family on it, and just moments like that, sometimes it is, in some programs, it is just a picture on the wall or a word on the wall, but it sounds like it was legit there. It was real, and happy they were able to support you there. Now, just real quick, we spend most of our time talking about the coaching process, but obviously you mentioned you played at Iowa. You started off as a walk-on. You earned a scholarship immediately, and you become a 4-year starter under, one of the more storied head football coaches, to be in the profession. What kind of respect level for walk-ons do you have, or did you gain from, kind of going through that process yourself and, fight tooth and nail and just earning those roles?
One of the things I always say to our coaches is when we have a freshman coming in the building, or in today's world that we're in, a portal player or anybody that's entering the building for the first time, I always say, hey, they only know what they know, right? They're only going to be guided and know the moments they've been involved in. You don't expect them to know something that everybody else has learned. You got to teach each case individually for what it is. And for me, coming out of high school in 1988, I didn't know recruiting. I didn't know what it meant. I was recruited a little bit, but I was just honored and blessed to have an opportunity to walk on at the University of Iowa. The reason I chose that place was they had a tradition in history that was pretty strong of rewarding walk-ons and what it was. And then I just knew this. My dad gave me a quote early in my life where it said, it's better to play in excellence than excel in mediocrity. And I'm not saying lower levels were mediocrity or anything like that, but he was really trying to press me and encourage me to go beyond what was in front of me, right? And that's ultimately what drove me to go to Iowa. I was very fortunate to find a spot pretty early. I played as a freshman, literally got chances to start as early as my sophomore year, and just really took advantage of the opportunities that I was given. And that's the part I've really tried to catapult today to my job and where I'm at is, doesn't really matter if a kid's a 5-star, a 1-star, he's a no-star, anywhere in between. Take every kid for what he is and teach him as you know it. And usually a lot of good things can happen.
Amen. Amen. Now, just to brag on your career a little bit, you ended up being the team captain your senior year, 1990 Big Ten champs, earned a free agent contract with the Seattle Seahawks in 93, played a little arena football in 94. So, you took off and ran with that opportunity, but ultimately you ended up back at Iowa in 94. Now, my question is, and this is always unique when you're able to kind of come back to your alma mater immediately after playing, but how did you let Coach Fry know that you were interested? You know, you said you never really knew. So at what point did you make that reach out to him?
You know, again, I leaned on my assistant coach. Ted Gill was my D-line coach. My last 2 years was a huge influence in my life that I had never even expected to see coming and just got close. And even as a player, I used to think he liked other players more, right? But in the end, he was the one that stood up for me and got me the GE opportunity. Really, Coach Fry approached me. I didn't ever see myself naturally going down that path. I had a wonderful career with the Seahawks. I was there 6 days before they cut me.
Okay.
And I joke all the time. I actually was living on a pretty minimal amount in my old checking account. I think I had about $30 in my ATM card, and I would go to this one place. It was Yinqing Cafe in Iowa City, and it was all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet. And the one thing I remember is I got a fortune cookie one day that said, Confucius says, choose a job you love, you'll never work a day in your life, right? And I literally had a call from Coach Fry that day to ask to come see him. He asked me if I'd be interested in becoming a graduate assistant. They didn't have any positions open at that time, but he was trying to forecast for January. So the first year I was out of football, I actually double dipped. I was in the weight room as an hourly assistant, and I was working in our foundation as an hourly assistant there. So it kind of allowed me to double dip into the coaching world and also learn the business side of it, which was hugely beneficial. And then in January, I became a graduate assistant coach, and really the rest is history and never looked back. I was very fortunate. I only did that for about a year and a half. Then I was named a full-time linebacker coach, became a coordinator before I was 30 at Kansas State. I was a co-coordinator, then became a defense coordinator at Wisconsin. My 4 years as a coordinator title, I believe we had the number one defense in the country 3 of those 4 years, which kind of parlayed me into the opportunity to become a head coach. And, now I'm entering my 16th year as a head coach, 32nd year overall in coaching. And although I learned it early on, I don't believe I've worked a day in my life yet, right? The highest of the high days and the lowest of the lows. I've loved every minute of this job and what it means.
Absolutely. And that's, we typically keep everything pretty chronological, but I love that you recapped or kind of looked at your career thus far because, like you said, they called you. I mean, you weren't even seeking this opportunity, and they called you. And so I do want to ask the question for, we do have some players that listen to the podcast and know they want to get into the profession. What were some of the things, maybe you don't know, but what do you think some of the things were that you were doing as a player, as a player that those guys, specifically your defensive line coach saw that said, this is the guy that needs to be on the side of the ball?
So I played a lot of football. I wouldn't say I was necessarily a very talented player, but I did know what we're doing, how we're doing it. I think I probably knew more. Now as I look back at it, I probably was pretty easily coached. I would also pick up on things. I remember one year we were playing a Big Ten opponent in our conference that literally every time he was running to his right, he put his right hand down. Every time he was running to his left, put his left hand down. I kind of picked up on it, made it reference. I brought it in to Coach Gill, presented it with him, and he said, "Oh, that's pretty good. Let me look at that." And then we kind of put a game plan in around it. Some checks. We were using River Lake calls. I was with a guy by the name of Mike Wells, who went on to have a great career in the NFL, and Ron Gator was my other D. I was a nose. They were my two near D tackles, D ends. And I literally said on Thursday to Coach Gill, I said, "Hey, this is all good, but what if he isn't in the game or he gets hurt?" He goes, "Let's pray he stays in the game forever," right? And lo and behold, he sprained his ankle in the middle of the third quarter and got took out.
Yeah.
So our game plan wasn't as good. But I think I reflect back to that moment that they probably realized I probably knew a little bit more. I was able to guide a little more. And even now to this day, as a head coach, I would tell you the majority of my best coaches weren't necessarily the best players. They were the players that were good players because of the way they learned, because of the way they taught, the way that they gathered their information, and then also just, I always think there's guys that proactively learn and guys that reactively learn. And if you find one of those guys that are ahead of what you're teaching them, that's usually the indication they're going to be a very good teacher.
Absolutely. Now, a couple other questions I'm going to ask you here about your early career. So, 94, you got finished playing, and is that accurate? 93. When was your last year playing ball? 93?
Yeah, I actually finished in 92. Began coaching in 93 as a graduate assistant. Back then, we didn't make a lot of money. I think I made $8,000 as a GA, and I actually had to pay my school out of that. I think in this world that we're in now, I laugh all the time. I was very blessed to have a family that allowed me to live pretty rent-free at the time. But I did have my first summer. I needed to make as money as I could. So Coach Fry came to me and said, "Hey, he had a guy by the name of Lou Saban who was starting an arena league up in Milwaukee and wanted some players." So I quickly volunteered for that. And, man, I thought I was loaded. I was making about $800 a month or $800 a week compared to $8,000 for a year, right? I thought I was rolling in the money. I took advantage as an arena player there. Did that for a summer. Unfortunately, tore my ACL again, and that kind of ended my playing career. Yeah. I was a GA for one more year, and then I got my first full-time coaching gig at 94.
And so what I was going to ask you was, after just basically a 1 year kind of hiatus of been away from the team, you're coaching guys that, I guess you're a little older than the video game age, but whatever you did in the dorms back then, guys you were hanging out with and making jokes and cracking jokes with. How did you make that transition into like, hey guys, I'm a coach now,
Yeah, Mario, is a great point. Coach Fry actually gave me a lot of guidance. I always say that, our head coaches do a lot more than just coach football, right? They guide people. And so when I was a young GA, I was a leaner version of myself. So I just began to look different from when I was a player. I played in the 270, 280 range, and now I dropped down to in the low 220s. So he wanted me to do three things. He said, "Don't wear blue jeans anymore." Back then, I was wearing blue jeans every day and whatnot. He said, "I don't want you to wear any more blue jeans. Wear khakis." He said, "I think you look older with your glasses, so wear your glasses as much as you can." So I used to wear my glasses all the time. And then he said, "You need to learn to differentiate your time with these guys that you were a player to now when you're a coach, because, they're going to now be in a position that they're looking to you for guidance and leadership." So I literally kind of changed my demeanor and habits, the people that I associated with, the people I was around, and then really took on the demeanor to try and look a little bit older than I really was. It's kind of funny now at 54, try to look a little more younger than I actually am. It's kind of reversed, but that was definitely a distinct direction of my head coach to try and draw and then he also said something really good that I still use to this day. He said, "Just because you went from the locker room to the coach's locker room doesn't mean they're going to see you as a coach, right? They're going to see you as a coach when they believe that you are one, right?" And I'll never forget that, right? I knew what he was saying. He was telling me, hey, I needed to view my world in a way that was different from one they knew. And it was very, very valuable experience and a great learning lesson.
Absolutely. Well, that's awesome. That's great that Coach Fry would take the time to educate you on that. I've asked the question to many people that kind of have the similar opportunity to GA where they played at, and a lot of different answers, but never one where the coach just distinctively looks you in the eye and say, "Hey, this is what you need to do." Now,
to be quite honest, Mario, I had a very unique situation. So I had played for Coach Fry. He'd been there for a long time. I started coaching for him as a GA. I'd been a captain. I'd been a GA, and then he hired me full time. So as long as Coach Fry's tenure was, he had never had a player that had ever been a player, a captain, a graduate assistant, a full-time coach. He had hired Bobby Stoops back, but Bobby had never been through that whole process. He never hired Bobby back as a full-time coach.
Right.
Chuck Long was there with me. Chuck had been a player, but he'd never been a grad assistant. He had hired some other guys, but none of them that had followed that lineage. So in his entire career, I always felt very special that as long as his career was, I was the only one that had that lineage. And then, you know, after a couple of years of coaching with Coach Fry, he literally came in one day and told me he was going to retire. Sat down at my desk. Well, I was literally one of the first coaches he told he was going to retire. And I remember I was just so emotional. I just started, you know, I was crying with him and all these other things. He had a press conference later that day, and I get done with the press conference. I come down and I basically am about ready to call my parents and say, hey, and my mom said, she goes, do you have a job anymore? And I'm like, you know what? I don't know. You know, so I went through transition. And then when Kirk Ferentz came, I remember Kirk called me in and he called all the staff in one at a time, and he kept bringing coaches in and he kept firing them, right? And he kept firing them and kept firing them. And I was supposed to meet with him that night, and it kind of get pushed back. And now it's 8 o'clock at night and he had to go somewhere. He came down. He's like, hey, sorry to get to you. Let's meet first thing in the morning. I said, Coach, I'll be here at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. Whenever you tell me to be here, I'll be here. And he said, it's great. We'll talk in the morning. So I kind of had all night to prepare for that. And I remember I sat down and I told Kirk, I said, hey, I know people have told you about me, and I know that people have probably recommended in administration that I stay. I played here. I was a GA. I've been a captain. You know, like I had a great relationship with administration. But I said, the only reason I want to be here is because you want me here, right? And ironically, he shared with me that when his son Brian, or who became up, was in basically junior high at some point, he'd come to camp. And after I got done working and coaching him in camp, I had sent Kirk a letter. And I had shared with him that, like, hey, I don't know what your son's going to be. I don't know if he's going to be a Big Ten linebacker. But I do remember writing, you know, like, this kid represented himself the right way. As a dad, you would have been, because Kirk wasn't even coaching there then. He was with the Baltimore Ravens, if I'm not mistaken. And I'd sent a note to Kirk saying what a great pleasure it was to work. I had no idea he was going to be a head coach someday. Right. None of it. I was just trying to express, like, hey, you've been pretty proud of your son in this moment, right? And Kirk brought that to my attention, and also made reference to how many people away from the game had talked about my time there at Iowa. And he gave me an opportunity to stay, and thankfully did, because if I had been fired at that time, you know, or if I wasn't retained, I was relatively a young coach with 2 years experience. My whole path could have been taken off what it is currently. So I always make our coaches aware of the power of the pen, right? Like, a lot of people could send emails, a lot of people could send a note or a message, but somebody that takes the time to write a note with a pen and send it and personalize it to this day, I still think is one of the most remarkable plays you could have, and a way to gain someone's respect in a great way.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I was going to follow up with you with. There, you had to have some takeaway from that, and clearly the power of the pen that you share with your coaches. What an awesome story there. And so, you may mention you get promoted. I know we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but you get promoted from GA to full time under Coach Fry. What on earth were you doing to not have this passion to be a coach? I know that changed once you started. I'm sure it changed once you started, but like, that wasn't in your list of things to do. All of a sudden you're a GA. I'm sure you're learning quite a bit, you know, seeing that side of the football. And then within 2 years, you're a full-time Division I coach with your own room. What did you do to impress Coach Fry at that point in time for him to hire you?
You know, it's kind of funny. I was highly motivated by others, right? Like, I was definitely internally motivated, but I wanted to be the best at whatever I did, right? So I obviously wasn't the best player. I played, I contributed, but I didn't make it to the NFL. And I didn't know at the time. It's just I really wasn't that talented. I thought I could play well, but I obviously not well enough. But as a graduate assistant, they would always kind of compare you to other graduate assistants, right? Like, he did this, he did that. And I'm like, okay, when I leave here, I want the standard to be what I did, right? I didn't want to be compared to anybody else. I wanted to be the standard, right? And so I kind of just took the proactive approach. I did a lot of things before I was asked. I always, used to try to proactively think of things we could do better, and I would just write it down I couldn't type very well, and this was really before email began to explode. So I used to write a note if we did an event and I saw something that we could do better, right? Or we had a practice and I thought we did something that maybe we could have done better, right? I would either throw it in the person that I was directly reporting to or throw it in Coach Fry's box. He had an inbox that he would take information in, and I would throw it out there. And you know, it could be a simple thing like, hey, we were at this event. Maybe we should have taken some pictures for the media guide, right? We missed that opportunity. Or, you know, we traveled too much during a practice back and forth between fields. Why didn't we do it more centrally located so we didn't run their legs as much? Just all kinds of different things. I remember Coach Brazier, my defensive coordinator at the time when I was at GA, we were studying Michigan. Michigan was one of the few teams at the time that was running a lot of 11 personnel.
Yeah. And
this was before there was any computers or any of that. And so I basically took 11 personnel and I studied Michigan over the course of 2 seasons and began to realize that when they were in 2x2 versus 3x1, their run to pass ratio, early downs versus third downs, their run to pass ratio gave them some statistics that were kind of mind blowing. And I remember when I did that, he's like, what made you think of this? I'm like, well, I kind of just saw it, but I wanted to make sure the numbers added up. And that was truly one of those moments. And then probably the biggest one, I say this all the time, when I'm hiring, I love to hire from within. And I love to hire people, if I'm not hiring from within, other people that were promoted from within. Like when someone gives you a title or a raise, that means they appreciate the job you've done, right? So one of the things I took pride in is if somebody asked me to do something, and there was a deadline on it. Like if they gave you something and said, hey, can I have this? If it's Monday and they say, can we have this by Friday? I tried to have it done the next day, right? I would literally, there were several times I wouldn't go home. I would stay in the office. I'd do the whole project overnight to put it on their desk. So when they came in the morning, it was sitting on their desk completed. And that was a very powerful statement to them about what kind of worker I was. And I think those things you can't be replaced on.
Oh, I'm going to say this in a joking way, but this is a serious question. I can't imagine you sitting in a staff meeting there at Illinois and, you know, a GA raising his hand saying, Coach, we should have did this differently. So for advice, like, number one, where did the confidence come from to be able to, you know, send a message like that to your head coach? And maybe because you play for him, the relationship is just a little bit different. But, like, how can a young coach be tactful? You know, as they're sitting in your room on your staff, how can they be a little more tactful in giving positive feedback or, you know, just giving feedback that can help you out, help you be a better head coach?
Mauro, great point. And again, it's probably a moment of me for clarity and communication. I never spoke in a staff meeting in front of any other coach. Never.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like I would always, you know, write it down on a piece of paper. I would give it to the person that I was reporting to. So I very seldom gave anything. I didn't ever give anything to Coach Fry football wise.
Okay.
But when he was a head coach, he would constantly ask me about, you know, how we traveled, how the meal was, what were the players thinking, what were they? He used young coaches because they were the most connected to the way they thought for advice on certain. So on those things, I might put it in his box or say things, but I would never say it in front of other coaches because of the respect I had for them. Even the coaches, I mean, there was many coaches in that room that I love, but there were some that I learned more of what not to do than what to do for, right? Like you can learn a lot by people, good and bad.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I would never have spoke up in a staff meeting unless I was addressed. I would always do those in one-offs or in a nonverbal way. And I will tell you this too. I learned this early on from Coach Fry. As a head coach, you got so much going on. You can present a head coach or a person of authority with a great idea, and if their mind is not in the right frame of mind, like maybe they just had a bad academic call, maybe they just got a recruit that decommitted to them, or maybe a coach that they were trying to get committed to someone else. Like you could go in the greatest idea of sliced bread, and if you give it to them in the wrong frame of mind, it's not going to go over very well, right? So you got to really learn on when to communicate, how to communicate, and what the best effective measures there are.
Amen. Now, 96, first time been a full-time coach. You got your own room. It's easy to ask and all the good stuff. Obviously, you did a tremendous job to kind of stick around there for a long time and get better and better jobs. But what did you do wrong, or what was some hardships for you in that first job? Things you didn't think about, all those type of things that happen to every first year head coach or first year full-time coach.
Great question, Mauro. Seriously, and this has stayed true in my career as an assistant, as a coordinator, and a head coach. You learn more from adversity and mistakes than you do from success and moments of triumph, right? first off, the best thing that ever happened to me, I became an assistant linebacker coach, and I had two young men by the name of Matt Hughes and Vernon Rollins. Matt Hughes is from West Texas, small little town. Daddy was a high school coach, very, very coachable. Vernon Rollins was from Hackensack, New Jersey, 5-star kid, highly recruited, very, very coachable. Those two kids met at the University of Iowa and formed a linebacker corps that I was able to coach that was extremely talented. So I always say this, great coaches are usually brought upon by great players. And that was my first real experience. Like, I had two phenomenal players that literally catapulted my career. But not only were they great players, they were great. They were very coachable.
Yeah.
Both kind of thought differently. Matt was kind of a quarterback type, like you could kind of get analytical with him, and he had this old Texas draw, but he was very, very good about processing the moment. Vernon Rollins was extremely intelligent and high awareness. You had to really watch what you told him. He's a Hackensack guy that if you told him something one way and you tried to change it, he would remind you of what you had told him, right? And I'll never forget coaching those two completely different opposite backgrounds and experiences and spectrums, but they came together and formed an incredibly gifted pair. They still are friends to this day. I still communicate with them. I'm still in their lives, and I'm blessed to be in theirs. So that was one. But one of the great things I remember, I was sitting in a linebacker meeting in the spring. I was just thinking, I was a combination of Tom Landry, Dick Butkus, Bill Belichick. I was like Don Shula. I was all wrapped up in one, right? And thinking I was running these great meetings, and I saw both of them in a meeting. They were kind of opposite of one another. And I saw them marking something on a piece of paper. They'd look at each other and they'd mark. Well, I kept those two afterwards. They were my two best players, my two starters. I said, okay, everybody can go except for Vernon and Matt. You guys stay here. And I said, hey, let me see your notebooks, right? I'm like, what are you tracking? And I was using the word in a 45-minute meeting. I had said over 150 times. Oh, okay. And what really jumped out to me is I had no idea I was having this verbal stutter, but to them, that's all they were hearing. And so the ability to coach and teach is partly based on your ability and your knowledge, but it's greatly based on your ability to communicate. And whatever I thought I was communicating, the only thing they were hearing was And that literally changed my coaching style, philosophy, career. I put a camera in the back of the room, video recorded myself. I made a very conscientious decision to use my cadence, my wording, my verbiage. I've had that happen so many times in my coaching career where I've been able to help another coach with his cadence. And that was all brought about because I was truly blessed enough to be around two guys by the name of Vernon Rollins and Matt Hughes, who made me better as a coach by telling me about my weakness.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. And not to interject, because I know people want to hear you and not about me, but I had some players, and I would say deal, so you're going to run this deal, and they made the joke, and I had the similar thing. I didn't record it, but it just let me know I was lacking a lot of detail. If I'm using the term deal just to mean a route, mean a depth, mean all this stuff as a receiver coach. And sometimes that self-awareness, it can be lacking, but once you get it, it's huge and can transform.
It's so true. I guarantee every coach has gone through it. Someone may not want to admit it,
right?
But I promise you, no one walks in that room as an expert. Right. And the more humble you have and the more approachable you have as a teacher, the better you'll become.
That's right. Now, we spent a lot of time in Iowa, but I do want to ask this last question here. So from 88 to 2001, you're black and yellow. If y'all got a different color for it, I'm not familiar with it, but I believe y'all call it black and yellow. So that's all you know. And so, I just think it would have been very easy for you to just kind of think that the career would just continue like that.
Yeah.
Maybe you had been around enough to see guys come and go on the staff, but like, what was that moment of transition like when it was time to get a new opportunity?
It was incredibly hard. When Coach Price stepped down, I had a moment where I talked with Glenn Mason at the University of Minnesota. He had offered me a job as a linebacker coach, and I was kind of thinking about it, but I knew if the right guy came to Iowa, I wanted to stay there and be a part of it, and was so blessed to have Kirk come in and offer me a job. And then I'd been there 3 years, and then ironically, the worlds that we had collided. Bill Snyder was an offensive coordinator when I was a player. His son and I, Sean Snyder, had been the same age. So when Coach Snyder went to Kansas State, he'd always kept in touch with a guy by the name of Ron Amici back at the University of Iowa. He was an Italian guy that owned a restaurant called the Pumpernickel, and his his son, Paul Burmeister, was a really good friend of mine on the team, and we became close. Needless to say, Coach Snyder began to hear people talk about this Bret Bielema, Bobby Elliott, who unfortunately is no longer with us on this earth. Bobby got the defensive coordinator job there, and Bobby and I had worked together at Iowa, and he had told Coach Brazier, the guy I need is Bret Bielema with us at K-State. And so they approached me, and it wasn't a money grab or anything. It was a chance to be a co-coordinator. But I'd known nothing but, we called it the black and gold, but I'd known nothing but Iowa, and I was going to turn it down, honestly. And then I ran into Barry Alvarez and Bobby Stoops at the American Football Coaches Association convention in January. And they basically said, we heard that you got a chance to go join Coach Snyder as a co-coordinator. I said, yeah, but I was thinking about staying. And they go, no, you need to go, right? You've done your career at Iowa. You've been there. If you go and work with Coach Snyder, even if you're there for 2 months, you'll be a better coach in 2 months than you've ever been, right? Nothing against Iowa. It's just I needed to grow, right? And that little bit of experience from Barry Alvarez and Bobby Stoops, both those guys had been at Iowa, and they installed that wisdom in me, and that was a huge point in my career to go to K-State and have 2 great years there as a co-coordinator and play some good football and win some games.
What was the difference? Like, obviously you've been in this thing long enough and been around long enough now to kind of, it's all football. But what was the big difference from you kind of getting outside of your comfort zone and going to that new location?
Well, it's huge. I've been at Iowa so long. I've been a team captain. I was kind of a little bit of the golden boy, right? I'd been a guy that had been decorated now as a former coach and player. But I would say the big difference was, I remember I got the job at K-State and I didn't even go to Manhattan. They flew me right to Florida to start recruiting. And I was in my hotel, and for the first time now since 1988, it's 2001, they had sent me a bunch of K-State gear to wear in my first day of recruiting. And I'm standing in front of this mirror. I'm at the Fort Lauderdale Marriott Marina, and I got on this purple sweater with gray slacks and a white undershirt. And I'm like, what in the world am I doing, right? It was just so different, going from black and gold to purple and gray. But that was just the beginning. I had been blessed at Iowa. Norm Parker had been the D coordinator there and probably been the most influential man in my life from a pure X's and O's. He taught me the defense that they still run there today with Phil Parker. So we applied that kind of the defense that we were running at K-State. K-State had been really good on defense, but we kind of helped take it to a different level. We're number 1 in the country. And that was the backbone of when I became the defensive coordinator at Wisconsin, is just being able to teach a new scheme and a new philosophy to young men, because sometimes it's a little bit difficult to accept change when you've been so good. They had been the number 1 defense before. So when they started hearing new things being said, it wasn't exactly a no-brainer to listen, and we were able to get them to buy in and hopefully take it to a different level.
Yeah, now I do want to ask this question, and I could be totally wrong here, just kind of being slightly younger than you. I felt like it was a big jump in like co-coordinators, pass game coordinators, all these kind of things here more recently. And once again, I might be totally incorrect. I feel like it wasn't a bunch of co-DCs and co-OCs at that point in time. What was that dynamic like for that first opportunity for you?
You're exactly right, Mario. The only reason that I went to K-State is because I was given a co-coordinator title with Bobby. So Bobby and I had worked before for several years, and that made it really easy. Bobby knew the back end and knew what he wanted to do, but he needed someone up front that could really put the whole thing together with the guys.
Yeah.
And that's what he involved me in. And then he and I literally worked hand in hand in developing every install, every package, every game plan. When we would do a game plan prep, I would do a lot of the early down run and pass rush, and then he would tie in the back end and coordinate it. And then literally sometimes during the course of the game, especially if we were ahead by a little bit, he'd turn it over and say, hey, you call it, right? Because in theory, we had worked together enough. We kind of knew what each other were going to call before it happened. And I wouldn't have traded in. Now, I've kind of stayed in that module. I haven't just handed out those titles left and right like they've been given to other places. It meant something to me. I don't think you can have guys be coordinators and co-coordinators if they've never worked together. I think they have to think alike, or at least be in the same background to make it work. And it's something I really strongly believe in to this day.
And so in 2004, interesting conversation, like you said, the AFCA convention, you had ran into Coach Alvarez and Coach Stoops. Is that what you said?
That was in 2001, baby.
That was in 01. Okay, and so 3 years later, after them kind of nudging you in a direction to go to Kansas State for a little bit, you get an opportunity to reunite or join the staff, however you want to call it. Is there logic to what that conversation was about in 01?
Yeah, kind of crazy. So I go to K-State. I'm there 2 years. After my first year, we were pretty good on defense, and I get a call from all people, Mike Leach, who is the head coach at Texas Tech, and he offers me a coordinator job at Texas Tech, and I'm ready to take it. And Coach Snyder says, no, you're not going to Texas Tech. They run an offense that's not going to allow you to be successful. And, he kind of talked me out of it. Coach Leach, Mike and I ended up having a long relationship to this day. Well, so when Mike passed, that kind of always went back to that moment when I turned him down because he always gave me heat about it. But I actually bypassed the D coordinator job at Texas Tech. I also interviewed for the head coaching job at Ball State University. I was very young, didn't think it was even real. The first time Bubba Cunningham was the AD back at the time, and he called me. I didn't think the guy named Bubba Cunningham was even a real AD. I thought somebody was just joking me out, right? And so I went and interviewed for that job, and I wanted that job, but thankfully I finished second. They gave it to Brady Hoke, and I'm glad they did because at the time I was really, really pissed they didn't give it to me.
Yeah.
But it ended up being the best blessing because I wasn't even ready for that job, right? And so I went back for one more year at K-State, and that's when again, I got an opportunity. I was going to join Mike Stoops at the University of Arizona. Stoopsy and I, and Mark Stoops, who's now at Kentucky, were really good friends. They asked me to join the staff at Arizona. I was going to go there. I'd actually told them I was going to go there, but we won the Big 12 championship. Coach Snyder asked me to stay, gave me a little bit of a raise, and I stayed. But then about 3 weeks later, Barry Alvarez called me, and I was still the co-coordinator at Kansas State. But at Wisconsin, I was going to be the defensive coordinator. And a chance to call and run my own show. I ran to Wisconsin with Coach Alvarez. Literally took a defense. I think they were in the 80s or 70. They were not very good. And that next year, we were the number one defense in the country. I believe 8 or 9 of the weeks of the year, and really changed that direction. And that's what ultimately landed me the head coaching job a year later.
Yeah. Now, I know the answer. I know what you're going to say here. At least I think I do. Do you think you have that success as a first time, full-time defense coordinator, just the guy without having that little bit of a, I don't want to call it a stepping stone because you were still calling plays, but just having that opportunity to just bounce ideas off the other guy? Do you have that success in that first year, you think?
Without a doubt, I don't. If I didn't have that experience in working with Coach Snyder, not a chance. And then the other thing we did at K-State is Bobby and I worked together. We kept what was good, but we changed what we knew needed changing. And so when I went to Wisconsin, I was the only new coach on staff. I was the only I was the play caller, and I walked into a defensive staff with 3 other guys. And the first thing I had to do was teach those guys what we were going to run and why. So I kept the good. So a simple thing, their over was my under, and their under was my over. I had to change how I called the defense, but I knew it was better for me to learn that than to have all those coaches and all those players change. So I changed according to what they knew, and I think that was a very critical moment. I also had a really good player by the name of Jimmy Leonard that was in the back end that ended up being a huge asset for me as a coach as well. Had a guy up front named Erasmus James, who was a first-round draft pick. Antaj Hawthorne, who was a really good player, a bunch of really good players around him. So again, I was very fortunate as a coach to be blessed with some good talent, but I had that stepping stone at K-State. And as crazy as this sounds, right? So I was a defensive coordinator for a year that benefited greatly from my transition at K-State. But after my first year at Wisconsin, I was presented with the opportunity to become the next head coach at Wisconsin after another year of waiting. So then for another year as a D coordinator, no one else knew it, but I was training to be the next head coach at Wisconsin. So Coach Alvarez would have me sit in on meetings, press conferences, give him his game notes, game plan notes, and I learned how to become a head coach for a year before I became the head coach. And then my first year as a head coach, we went 12-1, and believe me, that didn't happen by chance. That became because I was guided greatly by Barry Alvarez and put in a position to have success by all the people I'd been under to that point.
Well, you start talking about coaching legends in the game, and especially at the collegiate level, I don't think you're not going to hear Hayden Fry, Bill Snyder, Barry Alvarez. You had the opportunity for over a decade just to sit around and be under these like monumental guys, and obviously in the time, I don't know. Do you know that? that's for you to answer, I guess. I don't know if you realize that these guys are just pillars of our game, but what was the takeaway from being able to prepare yourself for one of those guys?
You're exactly right. I had no idea. I obviously went to Iowa to play. I didn't know I was ever going to coach. But once I started coaching, I'm like, hey, I'm sitting here with a living legend. Anytime Coach Fry needed a ride somewhere, I raised my hand every time, right? Because I could not gather enough information from someone who was a living legend, right? He needed a lift to the airport. He needed a ride to some a fundraiser. I was a GA. He also kind of used to slide me a 50 or 100 every time I drove, so that was also a nice little X factor. But
right.
Yeah, I played and coached for Hayden Fry. You mentioned those others, but then I went to work for Kirk Ferentz in his first 3 years.
That's right. Yep.
Kirk Ferentz is going to be a Hall of Fame coach easily as soon as he decides to hang it up. So I went from Hayden Fry to Kirk Ferentz to Bill Snyder to Barry Alvarez. So I worked for 4 literally Hall of Fame coaches before I became a head coach. There are very few people that get a chance to be around 1 or 2. I was under 4. So I literally took something from everyone. You know, Hayden was a great players coach, had a great way of kind of relating to players. Kirk was a great Kirk listened to everyone and processed everything and made his own decisions. But I really learned the art to listen under Kirk. Bill Snyder, he taught me to leave no stone unturned and then to turn it over again. Relentless detail guy, relentless worker. And then I go to Barry Alvarez, who's kind of everything. And when Albie walks in the room, everybody in the room, even if he didn't know who he was, everybody in the room would have known there's a leader that just walked in the room. He's got swag, he's got personality, demeanor. And then on top of that, I became a head coach at Wisconsin, then at Arkansas, and then I went and worked for a guy by the name of Bill Belichick for 2 years.
Yeah.
And to have that in my resume, to have those 5 guys as mentors, has been an unbelievable price tag in my career that I can't even imagine the value of that for everybody else.
Yeah. So as you talked about some of these stops here, you know, been able to get Wisconsin as a top, you know, defense, Kansas State winning the Big 12, you know, all the success that you had at Iowa. And then you get this head coaching job, and you won 3 straight Big 10 championships, 10-12. You 6 consecutive bowl appearances, first head coach in Big 10 history to win 10 games in the first season. And all these little nuggets. Hopefully you chuckle here because I'm kind of joking, but it's kind of a serious question. But like, do you sit back and say, "Dang, this is easy"? You know, or do you realize how tough this, you know, what you're doing is, but are you really seen as the successful part? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll never forget. My first year, we went 12-1. My only loss, we lost to Michigan in the Big House in a game that I think now in my career, I think we would have won. I probably did some things in the end of game that I would have done differently. But, you know, we're sitting there 12-1, and I run into Lloyd Carr in spring meetings. And Coach Carr comes up to me, and he said, "Now, wait a minute." He said, "You went 12-1. You're 35 years old," or whatever it was, 36 years old. He said, you went to you know, at that time we went to the Capital One Bowl, which was kind of a very big bowl, and beat Auburn or beat Arkansas. And he said, "And you're not married?" And I said, "No." He goes, "Man, don't screw this up." Right. And I'll never forget, just because, you know, I only knew what I knew. But one thing I did know is, you know, we won 12, we won 9, and my next year we won 7. And during that 7-win season, which we still went to a bowl game, that adversity we struck was very, very big part of my career from that point forward. The next year we won 10, and then that next year it propelled us to 3 straight Big 10 championships, right? And I think to go through some of that adversity really catapulted me past where we are, right? So I got a book from a very good friend of mine by the name of Ted Kellner, who was a huge booster, but a great friend of mine from the University of Wisconsin. And there's a book called From Good to Great. And one of the key coaching points in that book, you know, it was all business oriented, but I applied it to my teams. And a lot of times people worry about getting the right people on the bus, right? Getting the right people on the bus to go to the stadium, getting the right people on the bus to have your work environment be great. But one of the key factors was getting the wrong people off the bus. And I think it really taught me early on that sometimes you got to have a little bit of subtraction to have some great addition, right? And one of the changes I made before we went to those 3 championship runs is I removed some things that I felt were keeping us from being great. We were good, but we weren't great, right? And then we won 3 Big 10 titles, which at that time hadn't been done in over 30, 40 years. So even to this day, I know as success has come to us here at Illinois and some of the adversity we've had, it's the things I learned during my moments of adversity during Arkansas and some of the transition that I went through to truly help us where we are right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting quote. I mean, I've heard people on the podcast, you know, we're 400 episodes in. I've heard people say, yeah, you got to get the right people on the bus. I had never heard the opposite of it. And now you're in position to first identify it, and then second, maybe have some tough conversations, you know, maybe make some tough decisions. How is that aspect as a first-time coordinator, as a first-time head coach, where you're the one that has to maybe have the tough talk or the tough self-eval, you know?
Yeah, you know, again, you probably don't understand until you're in this role, but like you learn so much from people that you're around that you never have any idea you're learning it while you're living it, right? So I'm literally getting ready to be the head coach of Wisconsin. I was taking over Barry Alvarez's staff, and I knew at the end of the year we were a good team. We'd won 8, 9, 10 games, and I was going to transition from several guys on his staff to create my staff. But these are guys that I'd worked with for 2 years, and it was literally just crushing my heart on a daily. And we had won our last game, a lot of great mojo. And after the game, I was realizing that I would no longer coach with some of these guys ever again. And I was going to actually have many of these guys became unemployed because I was going to move on and give us a new look. I basically, at that time, there were 9 coaches on our staff, and I had to let 6 of those coaches go to move on. And that ultimately went to a 12-1 season. But I was low as low gets, and my mom came up to me and said, what's on your heart? Like, I can tell something's on your heart. And I'm like, well, there's just some things. She goes, you're worried about the people that you're going to have to let go at the end of the season to make room for your staff. And I'm like, yeah, Mom. Like, Mom never coached down a football in her life, right? Never played it. But she knew it. And she said, well, I want you to know something. She goes, that's part of Barry Alvarez's staff. They're not part of your staff. And I literally take that moment and think about it all the time. Like, I can't be responsible for things I'm not a part of, right? But it was a great way to remind me of I got to do what I needed to do. And really, my first difficult conversation, right, when I had to make some hard conversations as a coordinator, as a head coach, now repeatedly since then as a head coach, some of those hardest conversations are the most rewarding in the end. They're hard to say. They're hard to get through, and they're very hard to deal with. But they end up being the most rewarding ones of your life, right? And I think that's the part about this job. Nothing ever comes easy. And sometimes the most difficult moments are the ones that are the most rewarding in the end. And that's something you only learn through going through it.
Absolutely, Coach. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I know that's part of the profession. I mean, it just is, and sometimes it's tough to talk about and deal with, but it just is a part of the profession. Now, let's talk about the transition to Arkansas, and you know, after a extremely successful stint in Wisconsin, you make the decision to be the head ball coach there at Arkansas. Now, feel free to express as much or as little as you want in regards to your decision making in that process. But you know, what was the transition like, nonetheless?
Yeah, it kind of was a build. The year before, we had won our second Big Ten championship. In early December, I had gotten a call, actually the night of the Heisman Trophy ceremony. I had a guy by the name of Monty Ball was up on stage, but also Russell Wilson had gotten votes that year. And I got a call from Jeff Ireland, who was at the time the GM of the Dolphins, and he wanted to know my interest in the Miami Dolphins job. And I was just like, you know, I'm literally going to my second Rose Bowl. The year before, we lost a heartbreaker to TCU. I really liked my team. I liked our chances. We were playing an undefeated or maybe a one-loss Oregon team in the Rose Bowl. I'm like, I want to stay in this job. I want to win the Rose Bowl. But in January, if the job is still open, please call me. But I don't want to interview for it now. Got too many things going. So fast forward to January. It's like a day or two after the Rose Bowl, and I get a call again. And they're like, hey, our job's still open. Would you interview? So I was going to Florida anyway to recruit. So I manipulated my schedule a little bit. I didn't tell anybody. And I went and interviewed for the Dolphins job. And I'll never forget, I interviewed with Jeff the day before. The next day we go to Stephen Ross's house, and I was at his place, and we're about 2 hours into the morning, and he said, hey, can you step outside? So I stepped outside, and I called my wife now, my fiance at the time. We were getting married about a month or two later. I said, hey, I think this guy's going to offer me the job. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I think he's going to offer me the Dolphins job. So I did. He did. We kind of went through the process. The next day we were working through details, and it just wasn't something that the timing was right. Ironically, a player of mine called who had lost a relative, and I remember sitting with him that night, kind of both very emotional. I remember being a young man that was greatly affected by the way my coaches handled me in a moment of adversity with the passing of my sister, and now I'm doing it firsthand with someone who had just lost their uncle. And I literally remember that night saying, I'm not ready to leave this job, right? And I didn't take that job, and then the next year we go back, we win a Rose Bowl again, or we win a Big Ten championship. That year was really cool because at the beginning of the year, we lost to a Nebraska team in a heartbreaker by like a field goal, and we met them in a rematch game about 2 months later, and we beat them like 70-15 or something. It was a really big difference. And I knew how much our teams improved during the year. So after that game, I literally got bombarded with the University of Arkansas, reached out to me. I'd been the head coach of Wisconsin for 7 years. A lot's been said about it, but I just really was, my wife and I were married for a year. We just got married right before the year started last year, the year before. And I just felt I needed to change. I'd been there 7 years, wanted to try the SEC. It had nothing to do with anything that everybody kind of reported. Albie and I were as good as human beings. He was one of my best friends, my mentor, my coach. But I just felt it was time for a change. And when change happens, people always got to have reasons. So I left Wisconsin, had a great experience there, incredible people in my life to this day. Went to Arkansas, had a first year 3-9, but we went to 3 straight bowl games after that. And really felt what we had turned. And we were there 4 years, had won 3, or been to 3 bowl games, won 2 of those 3. And in my 5th year, we had a little bit of we had a difficult schedule, but also hit some bumps in the road. I lost 2 of my starting running backs, had some injuries, battled through a year. They decided to make a change, which they're entitled to do. One of my best experiences ever there was my 5 years in a community that was awesome, around a lot of great people. They transitioned from me, and then I went to the NFL for 3 years. And that little window of 8 years has probably been one of the most influential times, not just in my coaching career, but in my life. Which is really preparing me for the moment I'm in now.
Absolutely, Coach. I'm looking at the time here, and I only got a couple minutes with you. So I'm going to ask a little bit about the transition from Arkansas. We'll kind of lump, although a Super Bowl championship in there is pretty cool, but we'll lump the NFL experience up a little bit, and then I'll get you out of here. But this is the first time you've been let go at this point in time at the Arkansas at that Arkansas deal. So what's the old saying? You're not a ball coach until you've been fired. Somehow you've won a bunch of league championships and without doing all that kind of stuff. But what was that experience for you, just personally, being let go for the first time?
It was, to say the least, a very humbling, a helpless feeling a little bit as well. I really felt we were headed in the right path, but they got to make their choices. We had also had change in the leadership. Our athletic director, Jeff Long, had been left go. So I was meeting with an interim AD and with the chancellor and president. And I kind of felt it coming. I just felt they wanted to try change. I think they had a couple ideas in mind. I don't think it kind of played out how they wanted. I know they ended up hiring Chad Morris, and I believe he won maybe 3 or 4 games over the next 2 or 3 years, like something we were easily doing and so when things change, you never know how it's going to go, right? But the greatest thing for me, I literally remember the next day, we played the Friday after Thanksgiving, so I got let go on a Friday right after the game. Had a chance to talk with my team, my staff that morning. But on Saturday morning, I remember getting a really early phone call from Bill Belichick, right? And I remember Coach saying, hey, I know I just wanted to reach out to you. He's drafted players of mine in the past, and we've had a great relationship, but he said, when you get fired, you have this moment like you think you're the worst coach in America, right? And he talked about when he had been fired at Cleveland, and he said, just know this. He said, over the next several months, years, you're going to get yourself prepared so that the next opportunity that comes, you're the best coach you've ever been, right? And I'll never forget the message he gave me at that time. Now, I ended up going to work for him for a couple of years, but it was one of those moments where you're like, okay, this happened. Can you sit around and complain about it, or are you going to take this as a positive, right? And I tried to turn that extremely negative moment into a very positive one. And I'm thankful that I did. And ironically, in a weird sort of way, I'm kind of glad what happened there at Arkansas happened, because it helped propel me and get me ready. I needed that moment to get to where I wanted to be on the back half of my career. And thankfully it happened.
And once again, I know I'm kind of speeding through this. I would love to dive in more, but did you set out with a mission when you went to the league? I mean, were you trying to stay in the league? Were you trying to get a job in the league, or did you just want to go learn something?
I definitely love my time in college football. So I kind of knew I wanted to become a college head coach again.
Okay.
The idea that I did flirt with, and obviously with Bill and being in that room, Josh McDaniel was our offensive coordinator. My first year, I was truly blessed. I worked under Brian Flores on the defense side of the ball a lot, and it was his first year as a play caller in the league. So he did a lot to teach me the league. So one thing I did begin to think about was being a head coach in the NFL. But I think that would have been about another 5-year journey or so. And I was really anxious to become a head coach again. So I was there. We won a Super Bowl the next year. We were one of the best defenses in NFL history. I had a chance to be around some other good coaches. And then the opportunity came to go to the Giants. But when I took the Giants job, I wrote a clause in my contract because I knew some jobs were going to open up. I'm like, I really want a chance to be a college head coach again. And the Giants and their ownership were incredible. Let me write that in my contract. And I believe after week 10 or 11, this Illinois job opened up. And that's when they let me come and interview. And happened during COVID. It happened on a Monday. I got a phone call on Friday. I was the head coach at Illinois. So it happened very quickly, but it was one that I was ready and prepared for.
And last question here, Coach. Obviously, we could dive into the Illinois deal, but one of the easy reasons we were able to kind of connect with you is you just holding AFCA to a high standard, which you've always done through your career. But you joined the board, I believe, again here recently. Why has been involved in the AFCA? Why has that always kind of been a pillar for you and been important for you?
Yeah, great one. I remember going to my first American Football Coaches Association clinic, and I heard 3 people speak. I heard Joe Paterno, Lou Holtz, and Bobby Stoops speak, right? Bobby was a D coordinator at Florida and was talking about what he learned there. Joe Paterno was part of the legend circuit at the time that, ironically, he was still coaching, right? And being a part of it. And I'm sorry, Joe was an active coach and Lou Holtz had retired. And it was just kind of interesting to sit in that room and say, someday I'd love to be at the front of this room giving a talk, right? And kind of one of those fulfilling prophecies, but also just so easily influenced by the people at that convention and what that meant. And then I remember the first time I got a chance to be on a board for the AFCA, they didn't have to ask me twice. I'm like, I'll be there with bells on, right? And I think it's not what you got, it's what you give. And in this profession, especially where I am now, 16 years as a head coach, I have a couple guys on my staff. Several, I think I've hired now over a dozen former players. I got 6 or 7 guys in this building now that played for me in the past. I think it's more of a sign of how old I'm getting, but also a great recognition. We'll go recruit against a school. We recently recruited against Arizona. Well, the O-line coach there, Josh Oglesby, played for me at Wisconsin. We were recruiting against Michigan State. The tight end coach, Brian Wozniak, played for me at Wisconsin. We're going to go and visit all these places, and I have a former player, a former coach, literally, it seems like on every staff in the country, right? And to know you've touched those lives in a way that they want to do what you do, right? Like, that truly is a humbling experience. But also, I get more joy out of coaching my coaches to a certain level, or just as much as I do to coach our players, right? Because if you coach your coaches to be better, effectively you've already coached your players better, right? And that's the part that, I think without a doubt, especially the leadership at the AFCA, and have had some great leaders. But right now, with a time in our game where it's so tumultuous, where it's so unknown, where there's so many people trying to pull us in different directions, I think it's more important now than ever to be an AFCA representative and a voice on many different levels for our coaches, for our players, for the fans of college football, for the people that love the game for all the reasons we love it. I kind of go back to that first quote, right? Confucius says, choose a job you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And I know I've been a head coach 32 years in this business, and I don't think I've worked a day yet.
Coach, well, hey, I appreciate the time. Thanks so much for pouring into us here and just kind of walking us through your path. And then, thanks for what you do for us here at the AFCA, obviously. And then, man, like as you mentioned, you got coaches all over the country, and you're building your own legacy. And so I appreciate what you're doing for the profession. Okay, have a good one.
Thank you,
Coach.
Mark. I appreciate it very much.
Look forward to seeing you there in Charlotte. Okay,
absolutely. Be blessed.
All right.
CoachComm has been delivering tough headsets for tough teams for more than 31 years. It's why 97% of FBS teams and thousands of high schools across the country rely on CoachComm. Get the best for your team. Visit CoachComm.com for more info.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Inside the Headset, presented by CoachComm. If you'd like to learn more about this week's episode, head over to AFCA.com. There, you can access every episode and find corresponding show notes. Remember, you can catch every episode of Inside the Headset presented by CoachComm on wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. While you're there, we'd love for you to take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Your feedback helps us improve and grow. Keep up with the latest news by following us on social media. Connect with us at Inside the Headset, and remember to tag us when you share your favorite episodes. For more updates on all things AFCA, be sure to follow the @WeAreAFCA social media accounts. If you're not a part of the AFCA community yet, visit AFCA.com to join thousands of NFL, college, and high school coaches nationwide and across the globe. Elevate your coaching game with an AFCA membership. You'll gain exclusive access to the annual AFCA convention, magazine, digital library, and AFCA Insider email. Stay up to date with the latest stories and news on the AFCA website. More than just a convention, the AFCA offers continuous education, guidance, networking, and more. Celebrate the past and shape the future with the AFCA. It's about fostering exceptional coaches who create outstanding teams and even better individuals. Invest in your skills and make a lasting impact today by engaging with the AFCA. Your journey starts here.